Deborah Wesley continues an exploration of the symbolism of creatures of the air. Deborah?
I've chosen a few birds which have long histories with us. We'll see how these birds, and some insects too, the dove, the raven, the eagle, the owl, the fly, and the bee, have shown in art and history over the long period of human cultural history. Let's start with the all-time #1 favorite, along with the eagle, the dove. Here are some pictures of what doves actually look like. Still living in backyard trees and eating at our bird feeders, doves go back in sacred art to the Babylonians and the Sumerians, 2,000 or 3,000 BC. In ancient art and all the way up to the Christian era, they were associated with the great goddesses. The mother goddess Astarte of Asia Minor, whose priestesses were called doves, the goddesses of the Hittite and of ancient India. In those times, of course, doves were connected with fertility as well as with the soul. They've always been the birds of love. J.C. Cooper points out that ancient Egyptian imagery shows the dove perched in the branches of the tree of life. The birds appear together with the fruit of the tree, and they're also pictured with vases of water, the source of life in a dry climate like Egypt. From Crete, we have a typical image of the goddess in the form of 3 pillars on which doves perch. The pillar was thought of as representing the goddess herself. Probably she appears 3 times because she was thought of as the moon, and was thought of and was shown in all 3 of her phases, full, new, and waning. At about the same period in Crete, this bowl was used for religious offerings. A dove flies up from the center of it. You have to imagine this bowl filled with water or wine, so that the dove seems to arise from the life-giving liquid. Finally, almost 1,000 years later, we see the fertile mother goddess herself wearing a pair of doves as her crown. Another 700 years on, and we find the dove in the classical Greek pantheon, this time associated with, who else? The goddess of love, of desire, sexuality, fertility, Aphrodite. Doves pulled her chariot, and she's often seen holding a dove, as in this little ancient vessel from Rhodes. Johnson tells us that a flock of doves released during a festival in Phoenicia was believed to accompany Aphrodite or Astarte back to her home in Africa. The belief was that when she returned from her visit to North Africa, the doves had swelled from a small flock to a huge white crowd. In the middle of it was a dove with feathers of gold, Aphrodite herself, the golden one, here seen in her archaic form as a bird. Aphrodite was honored as the source of life by the Greeks and Romans. The Roman poet Lucretius speaks of her as equal to the intoxication, the drunkenness of spring, with the dizzy excitement of mating. He speaks to her in this piece of a poem. First fowls of the air, smit to the heart by thee, foretoken thy approach, O thou divine, and leap the wild herds round the happy fields, or swim the bounding torrents. Thus amain, seized with the spell, all creatures follow thee, whithersoever thou walkest forth to lead. And thence through seas and mountains and swift streams, through leafy homes of birds and greening plains, kindling the lure of love in every breast, thou bringest the eternal generations forth. kind after kind. In keeping with the original nature of the great goddesses who looked after both life and death, Aphrodite was also known in Roman times as a bringer of death or peace. She was called Venus Columba, Venus the Dove. Her catacombs and burial sites were known as columbaria, dovecotes. So the soul returning to the goddess after death was envisioned as a dove. Now, if we watch closely, we can witness an odd historic shift. Our dove, connected with the glorious life and fertility of the natural world and the sexual love that gives rise to that fertility, is about to undergo a transformation in the mind of Western man. And yet we can see the symbolic threads which link the old and the new. Starting in Roman times, the new ascetic religion of Christianity captured the psyche and the imagination and spread across Europe. The worship of instinct, of the body and fertility was replaced, bit by bit, by a new worldview centered on the life of the spirit. The distrust of the body. Now there was a masculine god in heaven, not the fertile goddess on the earth. Oddly, though, the dove was not forgotten or turned into a demon. Instead, the dove became a central symbol of Christianity, but with a new, old meaning. Here in the image of the Annunciation, painted and sculpted 1,000 times during the Christian centuries, we find again the dove. This time, the dove is the Holy Spirit coming to fertilize the Virgin Mary to give birth to the Christ child. So the meaning of the dove changes, but it stays the same too. Fertility, new life, but now life of the Spirit. Here, not yet touched by the change, 2 Christian doves, still part of nature, in a 6th century mosaic on the walls of a Ravenna basilica. The dove now takes a central place in Christian iconography, and in some early Christian heresies, the dove survived as the third, a feminine member of the Holy Trinity. The dove now becomes the Spirit appearing from above, bringing divine wisdom, inspiration, counsel, guidance to St. Luke, to Mary and the disciples at Pentecost, on the occasion of Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist in the River Jordan. Here in the baptism, the dove, so to speak, fertilizes Jesus' mind. Jung speaks of the common factor in the meaning of the dove as the spirit of creativity, saying, Jung says, numerous mythological and philosophical attempts have been made to formulate and visualize the creative force which man knows only by subjective experience. It's not without reason that the dove of Aphrodite is the symbol of the Holy Ghost. We also have the Christian legend of Joseph and his choice as the bridegroom for the Virgin Mary. The story goes that when the time came for her betrothal, the high priest called all the marriageable men of the house of David to bring their rods to the altar. The bridegroom would be the man whose rod would burst into flower and would also be marked when the Holy Spirit, in the form of a dove, should sit on it. Joseph saw himself as too old to take part in this, and when the ritual took place, nothing happened. And an oracle from the ark was sought out to explain this. The oracle said that the only one who had not placed his rod on the altar was the bridegroom. So Joseph then brought his rod to the altar, and everyone saw the dove from heaven alight on it and knew him to be the one intended for the Virgin. Lest we move too far away from Aphrodite's sexuality, the Freudian psychoanalyst Ernest Jones says about this, "The extra-canonical legend which states that a dove escaped from Joseph's genital organ and alighted on his head to designate him as the future husband of the Virgin Mary. The story is weakened in the writings of the later Christian fathers," says Jones, "who say that the dove escaped from Joseph's rod." In Christian times, the qualities of gentleness, timidity, piety, and humility came to be associated with the dove, as well as purity, innocence, and simplicity. "Be cunning as serpents and yet as harmless as doves," Jesus told his disciples. Christian folklore says that the devil can take any shape except that of a dove or a lamb. This contemporary African stone carving shows a dove from Zimbabwe in southwest Africa. Accompanying it is this comment, "This gentle bird coos throughout the African bush, offering its lovely rhythmic song. But to native mothers, this important bird serves as an early warning when lions or leopards lurk close to the village. When the dove stops cooing, then mothers know to gather their children into the huts for safety. The African dove is the host for the ancestor spirit of gentleness, laughter, and song." The dove represented the spirit for the alchemists and was an image for spirit hidden in matter, which they were trying to find and liberate. Hence the many engravings like this one of white doves flying up or out of alchemical flasks, released from the dark, beastly stuff that had been holding them captive. We can perhaps identify with the subject of this alchemical drawing, who sits suffering in the boiling kettle of his own psychic conflicts, until finally something clear and pure, some understanding of it all, is released above him in the form of the bird. Finally, let's look at the biblical subject that was of great interest to medieval Christian painters, the story of Noah's Ark. Here, as you remember, after 40 days and 40 nights of rain in a stuffy ark with all the animals, the deluge stopped, and Noah sent out scouts to see if it was possible to return to solid ground. He sent out a dove and a raven. This tale brings into contrast our dove and the raven, which we'll consider next. He first sent out the raven, a tough carrion-eating bird, which didn't return to the ark, giving Noah the idea that it had probably found some old meat left on a mountaintop as the waters receded. A week later, he sent out a dove, a gentle, timid bird which loves valleys and not mountain peaks. She returned, having found no resting place that she liked. A week later, he sent out another dove, which returned with a freshly plucked olive leaf in her beak, suggesting that the lowlands were drying out and life could begin again. Christian artists saw this dove as the faithful soul, returning with the sign of reconciliation between God and man. Mankind would be saved, God promised, and no more floods. Hence our image today of the dove with the olive branch as a sign of peace. The raven, on the other hand, became a symbol of the faithless sinner who leaves the ark of Christ's church for worldly pleasures, picking at the carrion. This 14th century painting shows the whole story. Noah releasing the white dove, the dove returning with the olive, the release of the black raven, with Noah's other hand, and the despicable raven eating at the body of a drowned horse down below in the water. White versus black, dove versus raven. The Christian centuries have centered on the ruthless separation of good and evil. In the new age now dawning, Jung suggests, there will be another understanding of the relationship of good and evil. Perhaps that one is necessary to the other, or that they are both parts of a greater unity. We can see this theme in the work of M.C. Escher, who gives us an image of the black turning into the white, and the white turning into the black, as if they complete or give rise to each other. Now let's take the raven out of this black and white frame of reference and see how he looks. For symbolic purposes, I'm going to consider the crow and the raven as the same. They're large, glossy black birds, which have always excited people's imagination. The raven is larger than the crow, a really big bird with a 3-foot wingspan. Ravens and crows have been associated since ancient times with death, but they've not always been seen as evil. Here's a painting by Vincent van Gogh, the last one he painted before his death by suicide. Here the black crows of death hover over the ripe wheat, and the ongoing road of life, perhaps, comes to an abrupt end, incomprehensibly, in the middle of the field. Celtic lore speaks of raven's knowledge. The raven sees and knows all, about the living as well as the dead. He had supernatural powers of prophecy and functioned as twin ravens, as spies and messengers for the Norse and Germanic gods, Odin and Wotan, bringing them news of the whole world. He was often a tale-teller, too. For instance, Edinger, in Anatomy of the Psyche, retells the Greek myth of the birth of Asclepius, the divine healer, whose oath is still taken by physicians today. Asclepius' mother was Coronis, the crow maiden. She was pregnant with Asclepius by the sun god Apollo when she had intercourse with someone else. The crow reported this to Apollo and was turned from white to black for reporting it too late. Coronis was killed in punishment, but the infant Asclepius was taken from her body while she was on her funeral pyre. So this basic image of the healer, Asclepius, sprang from both darkness and light, both the crow and the sun. Karenyi says that the story shows the ability of the healer to be at home in the darkness of suffering, and there to find germs of light and recovery with which, as though by enchantment, to bring forth Asclepius, the healer, the healing. Seeing a crow or a raven was often considered an ill omen, an omen of destruction or death. Ravens were the companions, or at times the form taken by the Valkyrie, the winged women of German myth, who came to the battlefield to decide the death of warriors and to carry the dead heroes to heaven. You'll remember, too, the old familiar poem by Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven, in which Poe, in a state of depression over the death of his love, is visited by a raven which comes and sits over his doorway. At first he thinks the bird is funny. Then he discovers that it can say an English word, nevermore. Ultimately, he begins asking it questions. Will I ever be reunited with my love, Lenore? Will I ever get over my grief? To each question, the bird croaks out, nevermore. As the questions get more serious, he gets more haunted by the oracular feeling of the reply and tries to get the bird out of the house. but it will not leave, and he concludes that he will be shadowed by it forever. Here we can imagine that the great black bird is the image of the poet's grief, his depressed thoughts, and his dreadful intuitions of death, which will not leave him alone. To the Greeks and the Norse peoples, the raven was a symbol of wisdom. He was connected with Apollo, but also with Saturn, and all that implies, all that Saturn implies in terms of the mixture of darkness, melancholy, and wisdom, and the creation of consciousness. Even in Christian times, when the raven was often seen as an image of the devil, legends persisted that the saints, especially the saints who were ascetic hermits, were brought food by a divine messenger, a raven, like this one. I think of this raven as an image of the kind of somber wisdom which comes to the ascetic in his solitary life. The raven is a creator god to some of the Native American groups of our Pacific Northwest. He's not, however, a light god, but a trickster, liar, cheat, and a fornicator of vast prowess. On the other hand, the raven or crow in fairy tales or dreams can symbolize the forces of evil, the devil, the terrible father. In the 1940s, during the Second World War, the Tower of London was bombed by the Germans, and the ravens which had lived there for hundreds of years abandoned it. We learn from Rowland's book, Birds with Human Souls, that the English belief was that when the ravens left a family's property, the family was doomed. And legend had it that when the ravens deserted the Tower of London, England would fall. Winston Churchill, the charismatic prime minister during the war years, acted quickly. He is said to have had brought to the tower from Wales and Scotland a great number of young ravens and clipped their wings. The raven was an important image in alchemy, which Jung saw, as a precise metaphor for depth psychotherapy. It was an image for what the alchemists called the nigredo, a state of introversion of energy and perhaps of depression. The alchemical parallel points out that periods of depression, psychological darkness, death in the sense of a death of the old way, are basic to spiritual growth. A 17th century alchemist wrote that the soul must descend into the divine darkness, into the darkness of Saturn, wherein no light of life is to be seen. And here the divine artist in this philosophical work, The Alchemist, will see the first color, and it is the blackest black. The learned philosophers call it their black crow, or their black raven, or again their blessed and blissful black, for in the darkness of this black is hidden the light of lights in the quality of Saturn, the wisdom of Saturn again. Jung translates this alchemical nigredo into something more modern, the experience in psychotherapy. He says, self-knowledge is an adventure that carries us unexpectedly far and deep. Knowledge of the shadow can cause a good deal of confusion and mental darkness, since it gives rise to personality problems which one had never remotely imagined before. For this reason alone, we can understand why the alchemists call their nigredo melancholia a black blacker than black, night, an affliction of the soul, confusion, etc., or more pointedly, the black raven. For us, the raven seems only a funny allegory, but for the medieval alchemist, it was a well-known allegory of the devil. Let's set aside the birds for the moment and take a look at some bugs. People seem to react to insects by and large quite differently than to birds. We see insects as mysterious, threatening, disgusting, and ready for extermination. C.S. Lewis writes in one of his novels that he was sitting writing by an open window, and he looked up and shuddered to see, as he supposed, a many-colored beetle of unusually hideous shape crawling across his paper. A second glance showed him that it was a dead leaf, moved by the breeze, and instantly the very curves and re-entrance which had made its ugliness turned into its beauties. Our projections on insects are amazing. Let's see what we can learn about ourselves from what we believe about bees and flies. To take bees first, just the concrete facts about bees are thought-provoking. Try listening to this brief sketch of bee life as if it were a myth. This material is from an unpublished paper by Peggy Gary called Reflections on the Symbolism of the Bee. A beehive consists almost invariably of one queen, several thousand workers which are undeveloped females, and several hundred drones or male bees. With the exception of egg-laying, which is the sole duty of the queen, and of fertilization, the sole duty of the male, these female workers perform all the tasks of the hive. They secrete wax, build and repair the combs, clear out refuge, stand guard at the entrance to keep out intruders, maintain a constant temperature by the beating of their wings, tend the eggs, feed the young bees. In addition, they forage for nectar and pollen, and then by a mysterious chemistry within their own bodies, they transform the nectar and the pollen into wax and honey. When a new queen is needed, they feed a few of the young bees with a special nourishment, and these young bees will emerge as queens, much larger than their working sisters, of different shape and anatomy, and will live 3 to 7 years instead of the workers and drones' few weeks. The queen's destiny as mother conditions every feature of her body, every moment of her life. As the organ of love, she has the respect and devotion of all her sisters, the workers. They caress her, feed her, and even absorb her excrement. It's a commonplace thing for them to die protecting her. The queen must be fertilized in order to produce more workers. This happens in the course of a flight high in the sunlit summer sky. As the young queen emerges from the hive, she's followed by hundreds of males, but only the strongest one can follow her rapid ascent. No sooner is the union accomplished than the male's abdomen opens, he loses his entrails and falls dead to the ground. Not only he, but within a few months all the other now functionless males are cast out of the hive to die. A perfect myth of the matriarchy, including the early death of the son, lover of the queen. It's not surprising then that bees were associated with the ancient mother goddesses of matriarchal times, with Aphrodite, Cybele, the priestesses of Delphi. But almost universally, the bee has been connected with the divine. In Indian mythology, Vishnu and Shiva are pictured as bees. The bee forms part of the hieroglyph of Egyptian kings. You see it here. In Egyptian myth, when the sun god Ra weeps, the water which flows from his eyes upon the ground turns into working bees. In Christian lore, bees were said to have sprung from Christ's tears on the cross. In both ancient and Christian times, bees have been seen as the soul. In folklore, the soul leaves and returns to the sleeping person in the form of a bee, and the soul of someone dead is believed to depart as a bee. Bees are also holy as just animals. The Koran says that the bee is the only animal spoken to by the Lord. De Vries tells us that in medieval Christianity, humming bees were said to be worshiping God. On Christmas Eve, in their hives, they hum the 100th Psalm. Beeswax is the material of the Easter candle, which symbolized Christ, and by the allegorical thinking of the Middle Ages, the bees produced this wax, and so they were the same as Mary, who produced Christ. Gary writes, bees were taken by the Christians as a model of all the virtues, an example of purity, chastity, thrift, communal work, altruism, piety, maternal devotion, self-sacrifice. Because of their asexual life, they were related to chastity, continence, the monastic life. A test for virginity in the Christian centuries was to send a girl through a swarm of bees and see if they attacked her. They also were said to attack men who'd been sleeping with women. Gary tells us that many customs in Western Europe suggested that in dealing with bees, special behavior was required of people. They must be spoken to politely. There could be no swearing. Bees would sting people who did not do their duty. Stolen bees would die, and they would not thrive if there was quarreling or disharmony or dishonesty. In many places, including the rural U.S., there's a belief that you must tell the bees if someone in the household dies, particularly if the master of the household dies. If you neglect this duty, the bees may die or fly away. Like the birds, the bees were pictured as messengers of God. A folk tale told by Gary pictures the bee as an ambassador from God to the devil. God finds himself in a dilemma. Only the bee is clever enough to trick the devil into revealing the solution to God's problem, which is that he's at a loss as to know what to do with the earth, which has become too big for him to handle, and besides, it's flat like a pancake. Off goes the bee and greets the devil politely. "Good morning, sister," he answers. "What has brought you to me?" "Well, you see, God has sent me to ask you what he is to do with this huge earth." To which the devil sneeringly replies, "If he's God, he ought to know better than to ask a poor devil for advice. I'm not going to tell him. Let him find out for himself." But the bee hides and waits for him to tell all. She knows the devil can't keep a secret. And sure enough, he says to himself, chuckling, why doesn't he think of squeezing the earth to make mountains and valleys? She starts to fly back with the information, but the devil catches her as she flies away and beats her almost in two, so that now she is black, she was white before, and has a narrow waist. God is grateful for the information she's obtained at such a cost. In many tales, she asks God for a reward, the power to kill with her sting. But he replies, just for that, you'll die when you use your sting. Finally, the ultimate virtue, bees are thought to be the source of poetry. Because honey is produced by a miraculous process of inner transformation, just as poetry is. Bees were said to have flown onto the lips of the classical poets Pindar, Homer, and Sappho when they were young. Sophocles, Plato, Virgil were all said to have been fed by bees or had their lips touched by honey in their infancy.
Well, it's one thing to be kissed by a bee and be poetic. I heard a dream last week, however, a woman had in which she was relatively assaulted by bees. She dreamed that she was asleep in her bed with her comforter over her, and she was wakened by many bees just covering her comforter, trying to get into her, and 2 or 3 had gotten under the cover. Well, she told me the dream and looked at me and said, "What could that mean?" And just out of the blue, I said, "Well, are you pregnant?" Intuitively, you know. And so I think when I hear you talk about the bee, that in one way it could be that the bee could symbolize that matriarchal consciousness that's all over her, wanting to get into her, as it were.
Wanting her to get pregnant.
Yeah, wanting her to get pregnant, to get impregnated, to get stung, as it were, by matriarchy, huh? Mm-hmm. But then it also occurs that it might say something about why it's hard for her to get pregnant if the bee symbolizes to her this busy bee business. You see, about the worker bees, and I'm busy as a bee and all that workaday stuff, right? So it would depend on the woman's association to the bees,
right? Where she really is consciously.
Right.
Tricky business, dreams.
Tricky business, right. And it has to have her context before one can really know what it means.
Yeah.
There's another insect experience I had I wanted to tell you about, because next you're going to talk about flies. And I remember once when a colleague of ours was about to give a talk at it was her first talk at a very big professional conference. People were disturbed because there was a fly buzzing around her head, you know, as she started to talk. And as she sensed the discomfort of the people in the audience, she said, "Oh, never mind. Now we know where the devil is." So talk about the fly.
Well, if the bee is the good guy of legend, the fly is the bad guy, symbolizing impurity, a fly in the ointment, you know, the bringer of evil and pestilence. Friedman, in his book, The Symbolic Goldfinch, lays out some of the ancient background of the fly legends. The fly was a symbol of the god Beelzebub in the ancient Philistine city of Ekron. Now, we know Beelzebub as a name for the devil, but in those times, the name Beel was a title for a regular deity, particularly a local one, and was often used as a prefix with the name of the city where the particular god was worshipped. We find the word Zebub in the Bible as a noun meaning flies. The whole name, Beelzebub or Baalzebub, then probably meant god of flies. That is, the god who can bring or send away flies. A number of ancient Greek stories tell of gods or heroes like Zeus or Hercules who were able to get rid of flies. And in Christian times, St. Bernard was said to have exorcised a huge swarm of flies who died instantly at the sound of his holy words and were shoveled out of the church in heaps. Not only was the fly associated with disease, but in the Christian transformation of Beelzebub was thought to be the devil himself. According to medieval legends, Lucifer and his followers are not permitted to dwell in heaven, nor with us on earth, lest they molest us. They abide therefore between heaven and earth, but God's design permits them to come down to try us. They ofttimes fly around us like flies, for they are innumerable and fill the air like flies. And again, one night while St. Dominic was in Bologna, when the brethren had gone to rest, one of the friars began to be vexed by the devil. His master made this known to St. Dominic, who ordered that the afflicted brother be brought to church before the altar, and 10 friars were hard-pressed to be able to carry him there. Then the saint said, "I adjure thee, wretched one, to tell me why thou tormentest a creature of God, and why and how thou hast entered into this brother." And the devil answered, "I torment him because he has deserved it. For yesterday he drank in town without permission of the prior and without first making the sign of the cross. Therefore I came into him in the form of a fly, and he drank me in with the wine. And it was found to be true, that the brother had drunk. At this the bell for matins, the monks' pre-dawn gathering for prayer, was rung, and at once the devil said, "Now I can stay here no longer, for the cowl-wearers are rising." And thus, by the prayer of St. Dominic, he was forced to go out of the brother. Here we see an unusual 15th century painting by Carlo Crivelli. The beautiful Madonna and the beautiful Christ child are accompanied not only by the little bird of the Spirit which he holds, but on the lower left by the devil in the form of a fly. The widely popular novel and film The Lord of the Flies by William Golding connects this image with what we fear in the modern age. Not the devil in the form of a fly waiting to infect the unwary, but the potential for decay, violence, and evil in ourselves and in our societies. In the novel, young boys stranded on a desert island gradually lose their civilized facade and descend to primitive levels of terror, destruction, scapegoating, and murder. This Lord of the Flies is a fly-infested pig sacrifice they offer to the terrible monster they imagine is roaming the island, waiting to destroy them. The monster, Golding makes clear, is only an externalization of their own destructive impulses. Now, owls. A night bird flying silently on its great wings, giving a ghostly impression and associated with death and with wisdom. This engraving of 3 owls on a prehistoric cave wall in France is almost the oldest image we will see here. It was probably made in about 10,000 BC. Following the history of this bird in art, we see clearly how the sacred images and animals of the old matriarchal religions were seen as evil with the coming of the new religion. Moving forward in history from the cave, we have an image from late Sumerian art of the great winged goddess Lilith. Flanked by her owls, she stands naked except for a tiara of horns, which was worn by all the great goddesses. She's a bird woman. Her spurred and clawed feet show her demonic power and indicate wisdom. She's a goddess of death. We find in Johnson's book, Lady of the Beasts, that Lilith's name in Hebrew means screech owl. She was much later greatly demeaned and demonized in the Old Testament, where she appears as Adam's unruly first wife before Eve, who refused to lie submissively under him as he wished. He then tried to force her, and she abandoned him. Adam asked God to return her to him. God's angels found her living with evil spirits, giving birth to demons. She refused to go back to Adam. Perhaps we can see a parallel to this debasement of Lilith from a great goddess to an unruly wife in the Christian legend told in the Woman's Encyclopedia that the owl was formerly one of 3 rebellious daughters who defied God, and as punishment was transformed into a bird who could never again see the sun, an owl. To the patriarchal church of Old or New Testament, the matriarchal religions and their owl goddesses were something that had to be cast out. In Crete, the owl was a spirit bird. This tiny gold owl was found in a 2nd century BC tomb there. There's also a classical myth about Glaucus, the son of King Minos of Crete. Once Glaucus fell into a huge vat of honey and disappeared altogether. Minos commanded the seer Polyidus to find his son. That night Polyidus had a vision. An owl flew about in a wine cellar and could be seen attacking a swarm of bees. Polyidus, being a wise man, understood the vision and drew the boy's dead body out of the honey vat, then brought him back to life with a magic herb. We can see the owl of this vision as perhaps representing the boy's spirit, fighting against the bees whose honeys had trapped him, or perhaps as the intuition of the great magician and seer Polyidus. The owl was not connected with the great goddess on Crete. We've seen that the dove was her bird. But during the 1st millennium BC, it became associated with the Greek Athena, the goddess of wisdom. Homer, in the 8th century BC, repeatedly referred to Athena as owl-eyed or owl-faced. He used the Greek word glaukopus after the little owl called Glaucus, probably meaning fierce-eyed or flashing-eyed. This probably relates Athena to a much older Mesopotamian eye goddesses, like this one. Staring owl-eyed images from Syria have been, and other places, have been found throughout the Middle East. By about 650 BC, the images of Athena and of her owl were the official emblem of Athens and were stamped on Athenian coins like these. When the Athenians defeated the Persians in a heroic victory at Marathon in 490 BC, Athena was said to have flown over them in the form of an owl. "There goes an owl" became a catchphrase for success. Still later, the owl became Athena's regular companion or attribute. Here she holds an owl as she watches over the hero Jason. He's being vomited up by a dragon that swallowed him as he tried to snatch the golden fleece. The Romans continued this convention in their Athena equivalent, Minerva, who you see here also holds an owl. Now we move along to the Christian centuries when the owl, no longer identified with the gods, became an image of evil and bad fortune. Marion Woodman has made this owl known to us in her book, The Owl Was a Baker's Daughter. This title is a reference to the young girl Ophelia in Hamlet, who says in her madness, "They say the owl was a baker's daughter. Lord, we know what we are, but know not what we may be." Her speech is a reference to the Christian legend that Jesus once asked a baker for bread. The baker put a piece of dough in the oven, but his stingy daughter rebuked him because he was offering too big a piece. The bread swelled enormously, and the daughter began to make owl-like noises. Ultimately, she was changed into an owl for her stinginess. Marion Woodman sees this as a metaphor for a woman caught up in outer world demands, who's not found her connection to her inner feminine nature, to her owl, we might say, remembering Lilith. The ominous nature of the owl continues. If you dreamt of an owl in the 2nd century, you would expect to be shipwrecked or mugged. Here, in the medieval illustration of the text of the Divine Comedy, we see Dante, reluctant, about to enter hell, pulled along by his guide, Virgil. Above the foreboding door of hell are 3 owls. Finally, let's take a look at that mysterious 16th century painter, Hieronymus Bosch. We know almost nothing about Bosch or about his personal associations to his paintings, but they fascinate us. Apparently, he was a thoroughgoing medieval Christian and believed in the fundamental sinfulness of mankind and of the world, though I must say he painted this sinfulness in enchanting colors and forms. This painting, the left panel of the large triptych, The Garden of Earthly Delights, shows the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve. As we approach closer to the center of the picture, we see the fountain of life. And at its center, which is really the fulcrum or the navel of the whole picture, although almost too small to be seen, is the owl of evil, the center of everything. The last bird of this series takes us out of the darkness into the light. Indeed, he was the light, identified with the Son, the divine, with resurrection, ascension, inspiration, the eagle. Keep in mind that this great bird has a wingspread of 6 to 8 feet and soars very high in the sky. No wonder it was thought that he could look unblinded into the sun, and that he carried his young on his spread wings. By this he would test them to see which could stand the light of the sun and drop to earth those who could not. He was also equated with lightning and the thunderbolt because of his swift flight. The Roman writer Pliny said that he was the only bird that was never struck by lightning. The Greeks thought that eagles were so closely akin to lightning that they fastened eagles to the tops of their temples as magic lightning rods. Eagles were thought to create storms by simply flapping their wings. With the great change in consciousness that occurred about 3000 BC, when the early fertility goddesses and religions were replaced by sun gods, the moon by the sun, the eagle first became the image for a new kind of spirit, a soaring one, detached from the earth. Huge eagle statues from cities in Western Asia have been found, dating from 2000 BC and 1,000 years after. Eagles were revered by the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Phoenicians. In India, the eagle became the Garuda, the golden-winged bird of the sun, an emblem of Vishnu. In Egypt, the same meanings went to the hawk, sacred to Horus, the rising sun. The eagle moved into Greek and Roman mythologies and art, where it represented the father god, Zeus. Here the eagle appears by Zeus's throne in his stead. In Greek myth, Zeus, in the form of an eagle, carried off the beautiful boy Ganymede to be his cupbearer. We must consider that this image is not one of pedophilia, but of the young ego overwhelmed by the creative spirit, carried away to inspired heights, carried out of this world. As social organization became more father than mother-oriented, the eagle was central as an attribute of gods of war and power, including military power, Etruscan, Greek, Roman, Persian. He stood for majesty, victory, and courage. Here Hector, a great hero of the Trojan War, a model of courage, takes leave of his wife Andromache as he goes to the battlefield. As it is told in the Iliad, they have a touching parting. Hector is not afraid for himself, though he knows that he will be killed and Troy destroyed. He's sorrowful about what will happen to his wife and son after his death. They will be prisoners and slaves of the conquering Greeks. But he goes off to fight, bearing his shield emblazoned with the great eagle, saying, "My dearest, do not grieve too much. No man will send me to my grave, unless it be so ordained. But destiny is a thing which no man can escape, neither coward nor brave man, from the day he is born." The eagle was the royal bird in Rome, the embodiment of the deified emperors. The eagle was worshipped by the Roman legionnaires. Each legion had its sacred eagles, carried into battle like banners. Well into the Middle Ages and after, the eagle was the symbol of the emperor, as here. While the eagle continued to be the image of temporal power, worldly power, the symbol was also incorporated by the Christian Church as representing spiritual power. Saints were said to come from heaven in the form of eagles. The eagle was the sign of generosity and the sublime, a messenger from heaven, the bird of God. Both Christ and St. John were represented as eagles. The eagle looking unblinded into the sun represented Christ looking directly at his Father. The bird's high flight was a symbol of lofty thoughts. He represented the Father principle, the Logos. To the alchemists, also, the eagle was the image for spirit, meaning. According to Jung, all the higher mental faculties such as reason, insight, and moral discrimination. But also pride, power, strength, speed, youth, success, and hope. A lofty image, one that could carry you away. And eagles were said to be able to rescue and carry people, as they do in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Although they actually cannot carry more than 11 pounds, it turns out. The great magic bird who carries the hero to faraway places is widespread in legend and fairy tale. The eagle and the great spirit bird stand for leaving the mundane, the prison of material existence, even the limitations of the body. Also for the breaking of tradition. They allow for the great vision, the expanded consciousness, a kind of mental flight that is widespread today and might be represented, for better or for worse, in the wish to leave the earth for other planets, to start afresh, rather than cleaning up the mess we have here. All this upward soaring, optimistic, powerful, bright consciousness has its dangerous side. As Jung reminds us, speaking of the animal images in alchemy, he says, "Even our sun-like consciousness has its dangerous animals. The spirit may be corrupted by pride or concupiscence," by which he means primitive desirousness, a fact we're inclined to overlook in our one-sided admiration of the spirit. We view solar consciousness with some distrust these days, especially in its disregard and destruction of nature. But consider this more naive view. Erich Neumann writes, "The eagle, the luminous sky, devours the serpent of night." Then he tells a Nayarit Mexican legend of how the sun, in the form of an eagle, first rose into the sky. Then his feathers grew, and he flew straight away to heaven. He rose up, this eagle sun, and stopped in the middle of the sky. There he established himself, turned, and looked down. His feet were a lovely yellow as he stood there. Brightly he looked around him. A lovely yellow is his beak. His eyes shine gloriously. There he remained and looked brightly upon his world. Very often, the eagle and the other great birds are represented as carrying a captured snake in their claws. You will also remember that the establishment of Tenochtitlan, the great city capital of Aztec Mexico, the original Mexico City, was long foretold. The founders would know the spot when they saw an eagle with a serpent in its claws sitting on a cactus. Here's a curious contemporary painting in which the bird and the snake are again opposed, but this time it looks as if the snake might win. This opposition between the bird and the snake, between the high flyer and the one who lives in a hole in the ground, between day and night, between spirit and nature, and between good and evil, has a deep hold on the human imagination. On a psychological level, we can feel the opposites inside us, say between wanting to fly free and wanting to be contained, or between the flight of imagination and life's demands for practicality, or between restless, wild energy and the need for peace and spiritual contemplation, or between one's pure idealism and some snaky, hissing resentment, or between head-trippy mental understanding and what one's gut knows. These opposites come together in a surprising way, in the image of the dragon. Dragons actually are not considered air creatures at all, but water creatures. However, you've only to look at one to see that dragons are a magical blend of snake and bird, a winged snake, as it were, and that somehow they bring the two conflicting energies of snake and bird together. Hence, perhaps, their ongoing fascination for us. Add to this the fact that they have burning fires inside them and breathe out fire and smoke, and that they love the water and bring, or are, the spring rains, and you can see that they bring the four opposing elements together: earth and air, fire and water. As such, they hold for us that fantastic image and the promise of a reconciliation of the warring forces within our own natures into the unity of the self. Finally, a modern myth about dragons and humans, from a novel by Ursula Le Guin called Tehanu. In the beginning, dragon and human were all one. They were all one people, one race, winged and speaking the true language. They were beautiful and strong and wise and free. But in time, nothing can be without becoming. So among the dragon people, some became more and more in love with flight and wildness, and would have less and less to do with the works of making, or with study and learning, or with houses and cities. They wanted only to fly farther and farther, hunting and eating their kill, ignorant and uncaring, seeking more freedom and more. Others of the dragon people came to care little for flight, but gathered up treasure, wealth, things made, things learned. They built houses, strongholds to keep their treasures in, so they could pass all they gained on to their children, ever seeking more increase and more. And they came to fear the wild ones, who might come flying and destroy all their dear hoard, burn it up in a blast of flame out of mere carelessness and ferocity. The wild ones feared nothing. They learned nothing. Because they were ignorant and fearless, they could not save themselves when the flightless ones trapped them as animals and killed them. But the other wild ones would come flying and set the beautiful houses afire and destroy and kill. So those who had been both dragon and human changed, becoming two peoples, the dragons always fewer and wilder, scattered by their endless, mindless greed and anger, and the human folk always more numerous in their rich towns and cities. Lagan's tale concludes that there are among us those who know they once were dragons, and among the dragons there are some who know their kinship with us. These people say that when the one people were becoming two, some of them, still both human and dragon, still winged, went on over the open sea, till they came to the other side of the world. There they live in peace, great winged beings, both wild and wise, with human mind and dragon heart.